I adjusted the heavy brass nozzle of my vintage watering can, letting a gentle, rhythmic shower cascade over the wilting leaves of my porch ferns. The Brooklyn morning was deeply quiet, save for the distant, a familiar hum of the subway rumbling deep beneath the cracked pavement. In my left hand, a heavily encrypted, custom-built smartphone vibrated with a soft, singular pulse. A notification illuminated the dark screen. Customs Seizure Protocol 4A initiated. Port of Los Angeles. 15 containers detained. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I didn't feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. I simply tapped the word execute with my thumb, effectively freezing the global supply chain of my daughter-in-law's multi-million-dollar eco-fashion empire in one silent, digital heartbeat. Without ever raising my voice or leaving my front porch, I had legally suffocated her entire business infrastructure. Pause. Before I tell you exactly how I orchestrated the total, methodical financial collapse of my aggressively classist, narcissistic daughter-in-law, let me know in the comments what's the most insulting, disrespectful thing a guest has ever dared to say about your cooking or your home. Drop your worst stories down below. Make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute karma. And let's rewind the tape to where this beautiful masterclass in revenge began. My name is Beatrice Sterling. If you were to walk past my home in this deeply working-class Brooklyn neighborhood, you wouldn't give it a second glance. It's an aging, narrow brownstone. The ivy creeps aggressively up the weathered brickwork. The floorboards sigh when you walk on them, and the heavy wooden front door sticks just a fraction of an inch when the summer humidity rises. I buy my coffee from the corner bodega. I wear comfortable, unbranded wool cardigans. And to the casual observer, I am nothing more than a retired public school teacher living on a fixed pension, quietly watching the world pass by from my front stoop. But anonymity, as anyone with real power will tell you, is the ultimate luxury. In the current American economic climate, a landscape defined by brutal tech layoffs, crippling inflation, and a desperate, clawing scramble for liquidity cash is no longer just king. It is an absolute god. And I sit very quietly on Olympus. I am the sole, anonymous founder and majority stakeholder of Vanguard Horizon, a notoriously ruthless private equity and venture capital firm operating out of a heavily guarded penthouse suite in Lower Manhattan. We don't just invest in startups. We own the underlying infrastructure they rely on to breathe. I have spent 35 years swimming with sharks, dismantling corporate raiders, orchestrating hostile takeovers, and burying arrogant men who thought their Ivy League degrees made them immune to financial gravity. When I finally decided to step back into the shadows to let my junior partners handle the daily bloodshed, I didn't buy a mega mansion in the Hamptons. I wanted the gritty, honest reality of the neighborhood where I grew up. I wanted the unpretentious truth. I wanted peace. More importantly, I wanted to protect my son, Julian. Julian is a brilliant, deeply empathetic architect. I raised him to value character over capital, deliberately and painstakingly shielding him from the terrifying, bottomless depths of my wealth. I wanted him to build his own life, unburdened by the parasitic leeches that inevitably flock to trust fund heirs. For the most part, my master plan worked flawlessly. He grew into a man of profound integrity and quiet ambition, but his inherent goodness, his desire to see the best in people, also made him dangerously blind to the subtle, venomous manipulation of social climbers. Which brings us to the stifling Sunday afternoon when the fragile illusion of my quiet life was violently shattered. Julian had been dating Harper for 6 months, and this was the day he finally brought her to the brownstone for a traditional Sunday lunch. I had spent the entire morning slow cooking a rich, authentic Louisiana gumbo, a complex recipe passed down from my grandmother. It requires an hour just to stir the dark roux to a perfect, mahogany perfection. The house was filled with the deep, enveloping aromas of smoked andouille sausage, slow-simmered broth, and the holy trinity of vegetables. It was a labor of intense love. I heard them before I saw them, the obnoxious, excessive revving of a luxury electric SUV echoing down my narrow, pothole-riddled street. It was a vehicle that screamed new money and tax write-off. I wiped my hands on my simple linen apron and opened the front door just as Harper stepped onto the cracked concrete of the sidewalk. I analyzed her instantly. It is a forensic reflex I simply cannot turn off. She was draped in what she clearly believed was an effortless, high-end eco-warrior aesthetic. But my trained eye calculated the exact cost and hypocrisy of the performance. The shapeless, organic linen dress she wore likely retailed for at least $2,000. Yet the weave was surprisingly loose and uneven, indicating a rushed, cheap manufacturing process designed to maximize profit margins, despite the exorbitant price tag. She carried a bulky vegan leather tote bag, which any industry insider knows is just a clever marketing term for heavily processed, petroleum-based polyurethane that will sit in a landfill for 1,000 years. Her oversized designer sunglasses hid half her face, but they couldn't hide the deep, visceral grimace twisting her lips as she surveyed my street. She didn't look at my house, she looked down at it. She sidestepped a perfectly normal patch of weeds near the curb as if it were a highly contagious biohazard, her shoulders completely rigid. Julienne, sweet, oblivious Julienne, carried a boutique bakery box and smiled warmly, desperately trying to bridge the palpable, freezing gap between her arrogant posture and my welcoming porch. Mom, Julian called out, his voice laced with that nervous, hopeful energy of a boy wanting his mother's approval. This is Harper. Harper finally reached the top of the stairs. She didn't remove her sunglasses. She didn't extend a hand. She didn't offer a warm greeting. She simply stood there, radiating a suffocating cloud of bespoke, artificially earthy perfume that immediately clashed with the rich, honest smell of my cooking. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping agonizingly over my worn porch furniture, the chipped paint on the railing, and finally, settling on my faded apron. So Harper drawled, her voice a slow, painstakingly manufactured vocal fry. This is it. Julian told me you lived in a transitional neighborhood, Beatrice, but I honestly didn't realize it was so. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure the insult landed with maximum psychological impact. Historically untouched. It's very brave of you to stay in an area like this. My private security team would have an absolute aneurysm. I felt a slow, icy calm wash over me. The specific kind of absolute calm that immediately precedes a catastrophic market crash. I didn't bristle. I didn't raise my voice to defend my home. I simply looked at the way her jaw clenched with unearned superiority, at the way she instinctively pulled her overpriced, plastic tote bag closer to her body, as if the very air of my porch might rob her. Welcome, Harper, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely unbothered. Please, come inside. I've made gumbo. She let out a short, breathy scoff, finally pushing her sunglasses up onto her perfectly highlighted hair to reveal eyes that were utterly devoid of humanity or warmth. Oh, heavy, ethnic stews. How quaint. As she brushed past me, aggressively walking into my sanctuary without bothering to wipe her designer shoes. She had absolutely no idea that she had just crossed a threshold from which her carefully curated fraudulent life would never return. She thought she was stepping into the pathetic, dusty life of a poor, helpless old woman. In reality, she had just voluntarily locked herself inside the cage of an apex predator, and I was already feeling incredibly hungry. The dining room of my brownstone is small, grounded by a massive, scarred oak table that my late husband restored with his own hands. It is a room that holds decades of laughter, heated debates, and the comforting clatter of family meals. I set the table with heavy leaven Prina 7, mismatched, vintage stoneware, and solid, tarnished but clean silver. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was real. Harper sat at the far end of the table with the rigid, defensive posture of a hostage who had been forced into a contaminated zone. She refused to let her back touch the wooden chair, perching on the very edge, her eyes darting around the room as if inspecting for vermin. I walked in from the kitchen, carrying the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven. The aroma was spectacular, a deep, complex symphony of slow-darkened roux, smoked and dewy, wild-caught shrimp, and the holy trinity of celery, bell peppers, and onions. I carefully ladled a generous, steaming portion into a wide bowl and placed it gently in front of her. "Please," I said, my voice maintaining a perfectly calibrated, warm hostess tone. "Eat while it's hot." Harper did not pick up her spoon. Instead, she leaned back so sharply, her spine went completely rigid. She stared down at the rich, dark stew with an expression of profound, theatrical horror, as if I had just served her a bowl of industrial waste. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her right hand, using only her index and middle fingers, her manicured nails tapping against the rim. She pushed the heavy stoneware bowl exactly 3 inches away from her. "Wow," she breathed out. A sharp, condescending exhalation. "That is very heavy and incredibly greasy. It's a traditional roux," I replied softly, taking my seat. "It's meant to be rich." Harper let out a dry, abrasive chuckle, looking over at Julian as if sharing an inside joke that only people of their caliber could understand. "Right. Well, Beatrice, my entire physiological ecosystem is optimized for high-frequency, plant-based micronutrients. My holistic nutritionist in Tribeca would literally fire me if I ingested this kind of slop. It's just so incredibly unhygienic. Don't you think, boiling all those dead, heavy things together in one pot? It's very peasant food." Julian's face flushed a deep, painful crimson. He stared down at his own bowl, his shoulders shrinking. "Harper, come on," he murmured, his voice entirely devoid of authority. "My mom spent all morning making this. It's her specialty." "Julianne, babe, don't gaslight me about my dietary boundaries." She snapped back instantly, weaponizing therapeutic language to shut him down. She reached into her massive polyurethane tote bag and pulled out a sleek, branded glass bottle filled with a cloudy, beige liquid, slamming it onto my oak table. "I have a multi-million-dollar company to run. I can't afford the brain fog that comes from eating poverty food." I took a slow, methodical bite of my gumbo. The flavors were perfect. I chewed in absolute silence, letting her words hang in the air, allowing the sheer audacity of her behavior to echo in the small room. I didn't feel a shred of anger. Anger is a volatile, sloppy emotion. What I felt was clinical, freezing clarity. But Harper wasn't finished. The food was just the appetizer. My home was the main course. She unscrewed the cap of her beige sludge, took a performative sip, and aggressively wiped her mouth. "Actually, Julienne, since we're here, we really need to address this whole living situation. I know you have some sort of sentimental attachment to this. Plus," she gestured vaguely around my dining room, her lip curling in disgust. "But it's completely unacceptable. It's a ghetto. Beatrice, you live in a literal ghetto." The word dropped onto the table like a lead weight. Ghetto. I stopped chewing. I placed my spoon down on my napkin. The silence in the room became incredibly dense. "There are bars on the corner store's windows," Harper continued, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo of unearned superiority. "The sidewalks are cracked. The people outside look like they've never seen a trust fund or a decent skincare routine in their lives. Julian and I are building a high-net-worth lifestyle. When we get married and have children, I absolutely refuse to let my kids step foot in this toxic, ghetto environment. It's practically a biohazard. If you want to be a part of our future, Beatrice, you'll need to let Julian move you into a subsidized senior living facility somewhere far away from here." I looked at my son. The boy I had raised to be a titan of empathy was currently staring at his water glass, utterly paralyzed by her psychological dominance. He was a victim of her expertly crafted manipulation, blinded by the polished facade she wore. He didn't know how to fight a narcissist because I had protected him from them his entire life. It was time for his mother to go to work. "A high-net-worth lifestyle," I repeated softly, the words rolling off my tongue like smooth glass. I laced my fingers together and rested them on the table, fixing my gaze on her. "That sounds incredibly demanding. Harper, please, tell me about your eco-fashion empire." It must be quite lucrative to dictate such strict geographical boundaries for your future children. Her eyes lit up. This was her favorite subject. Herself. She puffed out her chest, completely unaware that she had just eagerly stepped onto the trapdoor of her own execution. It's called verdant threads, she boasted, her tone dripping with corporate arrogance. We are completely disrupting the sustainable fashion space. We use proprietary, ethical supply chains. It's highly complex. I wouldn't expect you to grasp the macroeconomics of it, Beatrice. But let's just say, the big players have noticed me. I just closed my seed round on Friday. Oh, I murmured, tilting my head slightly. A seed round? How impressive. Who is backing your Seno? Disruption, she smirked. A cruel. Triumphant little sneer that solidified my decision to utterly annihilate her. A Tier 1 private equity firm, Vanguard Horizon. You've definitely never heard of them. They are the most exclusive, ruthless capital allocators in New York. They only invest in elite, visionary founders. They just wired me $5 million. So yes, Beatrice, I am operating on a level that this neighborhood couldn't even comprehend. The air in my lungs turned to liquid nitrogen. Vanguard Horizon. My firm. My capital. I stared at her. I looked at the loose stitching on her sustainable dress. I looked at the cheap, toxic plastic of her bag. I listened to the hollow, regurgitated buzzwords she used to mask her profound ignorance. My junior partners had clearly been blinded by her aggressive social media metrics and her polished pitch deck. They had deployed my $5 million into a company run by a deeply insecure, classist fraud. The cosmic poetry of the moment was so intensely delicious, I could taste it over the spice of the gumbo. She was sitting in my house, eating at my table, calling my home a ghetto, and threatening to withhold my future grandchildren from me, all while wearing a crown completely funded by my bank account. $5 million from Vanguard Horizon, I whispered, a faint, chilling smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. That is quite a validation of your character. Harper. They must have done incredibly thorough due diligence on you. They know a genius when they see one. She gloated, taking another sip of her sludge, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual genius behind Vanguard Horizon was currently sitting 3 feet away, calculating the exact legal trajectory required to repossess her entire life. I'm sure they do, I agreed softly. The lunch dragged on, but I no longer heard her arrogant whining. My mind was already leagues ahead, navigating the complex financial architecture of corporate destruction. She thought she had won. She thought she had established dominance over a weak, impoverished mother-in-law. She had no idea that she had just handed me the absolute legal authority to tear her world down to the studs. Part 3. The investigation phase 1. They left less than 20 minutes after the gumbo incident. Harper practically sprinted down the front steps, her faux vegan leather bag swinging wildly. Desperate to escape the toxic atmosphere of my zip code, Julian lingered at the door for just a fraction of a second. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a hollow, agonizing apology. He was too terrified to vocalize. He gave a small, defeated nod, then hurried down the steps to open the passenger door of her oversized, leased monstrosity. I stood in the doorway, my hands resting in the pockets of my cardigan, and watched the heavy electric SUV aggressively peel away from the curb, leaving a cloud of street dust in its wake. The silence that settled back over the brownstone was immediate and profound. I didn't throw a plate against the wall. I didn't cry tears of a broken-hearted mother. I simply turned around, walked back into the dining room, and began to clear the table. I took the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven to the sink, turned on the hot water, and meticulously scrubbed it clean. There is a deep, grounding rhythm in domestic labor. It centers the mind. I wiped down the scarred oak table, folded the linen napkins, and turned off the kitchen lights. With the house restored to its pristine, quiet state, I let the persona of Beatrice Sterling, the fragile, retired public school teacher, completely evaporate into the ether. I walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward the basement door. To anyone else, it was just a solid wooden door, leading to a dusty cellar filled with forgotten holiday decorations. I reached up to the vintage, seemingly disconnected thermostat mounted on the wall. I placed my right thumb over the faded temperature dial. A microscopic biometric scanner read my print, and a heavy, pneumatic bolt inside the doorframe slid back with a satisfying sly, metallic clunk. I opened the door and descended the wooden stairs. The air shifted immediately. The slight, comforting mustiness of the old house was replaced by the crisp, perfectly sterilized chill of a climate-controlled server environment. The basement was completely soundproofed, encased in military-grade acoustic paneling. In the center of the room sat my actual command center, a sleek, minimalist carbon fiber desk holding a custom-built, multi-monitor rig directly hardwired into the global financial exchanges via a dedicated, heavily encrypted fiber optic line. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair, the leather sighing softly under my weight. I touched the master power node, and the screens roared to life, bathing the dark room in a cold, blue digital glow. I bypassed the standard Vanguard Horizon security protocols I had personally designed to keep out federal regulators and corporate spies, and accessed the master administrative dashboard. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, a stark contrast to the slow, arthritic movements I feigned for my neighbors. I pulled up the Verdant Threads investment dossier. The file loaded instantly. I saw the digital signature of my lead junior partner, a hotshot Stanford MBA who clearly thought with his ego rather than his intellect. He had approved the $5 million capital injection based on Harper's pitch deck, which was loaded with visually stunning, meaningless graphics and aggressively marketed ESG environmental, social, and governance buzzwords. Founder demonstrates aggressive market capture in the sustainable Gen Z demographic. His executive summary read, proprietary eco-textile supply chain positions, Verdant Threads for rapid vertical scaling. I let out a soft, freezing whisper of a laugh in the dark room. Proprietary eco-textile supply chain. I opened the raw data. I didn't look at her marketing materials. I looked at the only thing that never lies, the supply chain forensics and the bills of lading. When you want to find the rotting heart of a company, you don't look at their Instagram, you look at their shipping manifests. It took me less than 15 minutes to systematically dismantle her entire sustainable empire. Harper claimed her garments were crafted from ethically sourced, organic hemp and recycled ocean plastics, processed in a carbon-neutral facility in Europe. I traced the alphanumeric codes on her import documentation through a maze of shell corporations, a basic tactic used by amateurs to hide their tracks. The trail didn't lead to Europe. It led to a notorious, blacklisted manufacturing district in Southeast Asia, a deregulated zone explicitly flagged by international watchdogs for horrific labor violations and zero environmental oversight. I pulled up the chemical composition reports from Customs. Her breathable, organic eco-linen was actually an incredibly cheap, highly toxic synthetic polymer blend. It was manufactured using harsh chemical dyes that were actively poisoning the local water supply of the factory workers. The fabric was practically suffocating, incredibly flammable, and cost approximately 42 cents per yard to produce. She was importing this toxic, synthetic garbage in massive, tightly packed shipping containers. Once the containers arrived at a sketchy warehouse in New Jersey, her team was simply cutting out the original factory tags and sewing in beautiful, minimalist Verdant Threads labels printed on recycled paper. She was then turning around and selling a dress that cost her $4 to make for $850, marketing it as the pinnacle of environmental salvation. It wasn't just a bad business model. It was predatory. It was textbook, fraudulent greenwashing on a massive scale. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The sheer, terrifying hypocrisy of it all was staggering. This was the woman who had sat at my dining room table, drinking her $6 bottled sludge, refusing to eat my food because it wasn't optimized for her pure, delicate ecosystem. This was the woman who had called my neighborhood a ghetto and a biohazard, while she was literally building her fortune on the backs of exploited labor and environmental destruction. She thought she was an elite mastermind. She thought she was untouchable because she had managed to secure a $5 million check from men in suits who were too busy looking at her projected revenue charts to actually check the fabric of her lies. But she didn't know about me. She didn't know that the capital she was burning belonged to a woman who knew exactly how to track every single penny. She had taken my money to build a monument to her own vanity, and she had used that exact same vanity to spit on my floor. I reached out and lightly tapped the screen, right on Harper's digitally smiling, heavily filtered face in her founder profile. "You want a high net worth lifestyle." "Harper," I whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the acoustic panels. "Let's see how you handle a high net worth audit." I minimized the supply chain manifests and opened the financial ledgers. It was time to see exactly what she had been spending my $5 million on. If her supply chain was this deeply compromised, I knew her corporate bank accounts would be an absolute massacre. The real autopsy was about to begin. Par quatre. Digging up the dirt, I pulled the corporate financial ledgers of Verdant Threads onto my primary monitor. To a junior accountant, the spreadsheet might have looked reasonably balanced, a complex web of categorical expenditures and aggressive reinvestment strategies. To me, it was a glaring, neon-lit map of severe fiscal delinquency and narcissistic delusion. I initiated a deep-level forensic scan, a proprietary algorithm I had personally written years ago that cross-referenced corporate disbursements with personal tax identifiers. It bypassed the sanitized surface-level reports and dug straight into the raw, unedited transaction history. The numbers began to scroll rapidly across the screen, highlighting anomalies in bright, aggressive red. Harper wasn't running a business. She was running a highly sophisticated, venture-backed slush fund. The $5 million from my firm was being bled dry at a catastrophic burn rate, and almost none of it was going toward the company. I expanded a line item labeled R&D Environmental Impact Immersion Retreats. $125. 000. My fingers danced across the keyboard as I traced the routing numbers. The funds hadn't gone to a research facility or a sustainability symposium. The money had been wired directly to a luxury real estate broker in the Hamptons. Harper had used the R&D budget to secure a sprawling, beachfront summer rental for herself and 3 influencers. I pulled up her public Instagram feed on a secondary monitor. There she was, posing on a pristine white sofa overlooking the ocean, holding a glass of champagne, with the caption, "Exhausting week strategizing the future of eco-textiles. Founder Life Verdant Threads Sustainable Luxury." I felt a cold, sharp spike of disgust. I moved to the next highlighted anomaly: corporate infrastructure and logistics fleet. Ibai Bashameyuan Ling Ling Ling. A logistics fleet should consist of delivery vans or warehouse forklifts. I traced the VIN numbers registered to the corporate account. It was a single vehicle, a top-of-the-line, fully loaded, custom matte black luxury electric SUV. The exact same monstrous, leased vehicle she had parked outside my brownstone to sneer at my neighborhood. She was expensing her personal, status symbol car through the company, classifying it as logistics to dodge taxes and hide the liability. The deeper I dug, the more grotesque it became. She was paying off massive personal credit card debts under the guise of vendor liabilities. She had expensed over $50,000 in brand aesthetics consulting, which translated directly to personal stylists, Botox, and high-end dermatological treatments in Tribeca. She was literally wearing my money, driving my money, and injecting my money into her face, all while lecturing me about the poverty of my existence. I paused, leaning back and resting my chin on my hands. In the cutthroat world of private equity, I am not easily shocked. I have seen CEOs embezzle millions to fund gambling addictions or cover up affairs, but there is a specific, unique kind of sociopathy in what Harper was doing. It wasn't just greed. It was absolute entitlement. She genuinely believed that because she had declared herself a visionary, she was inherently entitled to a life of immense luxury, and that investor capital was simply her rightful allowance to achieve it. I could have stopped right there. The embezzlement alone was enough to trigger immediate legal action, seize her assets, and throw her in federal prison for wire fraud. I could have called my lawyers, handed over the digital dossier, and let the justice system grind her to dust. But that would be a public, bureaucratic process. It would be entirely too sterile. If she went to jail now, she would play the victim. She would cry to the media that a ruthless, patriarchal investment firm crushed her dreams. She wouldn't learn the specific, agonizing lesson of consequence. I needed her to hang herself with her own rope. I needed to build a trap so perfectly engineered that when the floor finally dropped out, she would know, with absolute, undeniable clarity, that she was entirely responsible for her own ruin. I pulled up the master control panel for Vanguard Horizon's legal infrastructure. I drafted a highly customized bridge loan authorization document. A bridge loan is typically a short-term, high-interest capital injection designed to keep a startup afloat between major funding rounds. I authorized an additional, seemingly generous $500,000 to be deposited into Verdant Thread's operating account. However, buried deeply within the 70-page digital contract, hidden behind a wall of dense, mind-numbing legal jargon that I knew her cheap, inexperienced lawyers would skim over, I inserted a lethal, non-negotiable ESG extreme compliance clause. The clause stipulated that the entirety of the bridge loan, plus the original $5 million seed investment, was contingent upon a sudden, unannounced, and total audit of all environmental claims and supply chain integrity. If any material discrepancy was found, such as, for example, using toxic synthetic polymers instead of organic linen, the founder would be held personally and completely liable for the immediate repayment of the total sum, bypassing any LLC corporate protections. It was a financial suicide pact disguised as a lifeline. I knew exactly what she would do. She was currently burning cash so fast that she would be desperate for the $500,000. She wouldn't read the contract. She would only see the money. The sudden influx of cash would embolden her. It would make her feel invincible, validating her delusion that she was a genius who could get away with anything. I attached the contract to an encrypted email, flagged it with a high priority, CEO signature required tag, and sent it directly from the Vanguard Horizon automated portal to her inbox. I watched the delivery status icon on my screen turn from yellow to green. Delivered. I sat in the cold silence of the server room, my hands perfectly steady. The trap was laid, arme, and waiting. The arrogance she had worn like armor at my dining room table was about to become the very weight that dragged her down to the bottom of the ocean. I powered down the monitors, the blue light fading to black. I stood up, walked back up the wooden stairs, and locked the heavy, biometric door behind me. As I stepped back into the quiet, simple comfort of my brownstone hallway, I felt a deep, resonant sense of anticipation. Harper wanted to play games of class and power. She was about to find out that she wasn't even at the table. She was just a pawn on my board. And I was moving her exactly where I wanted her. Par 5. The destruction. It took exactly 32 minutes for the Vanguard Horizon portal to notify me that the bridge loan authorization had been signed. 32 minutes. That meant Harper hadn't forwarded the 70-page document to an attorney. She hadn't even skimmed it herself. She saw the $500,000 figure, panicked at her dwindling liquidity, and blindly signed her own financial death warrant using a digital stylus on her phone. The trap was permanently locked. Now it was time to pull the lever. I didn't launch a massive, noisy frontal assault. True destruction in the financial sector is like carbon monoxide, silent, invisible, and lethal before the victim even realizes they are suffocating. My first move was the media leak. Working from my encrypted terminal in the basement, I compiled a sanitized, completely untraceable digital packet. It contained the raw chemical analysis of her eco-linen, the horrifying labor reports from her Southeast Asian manufacturing plants, and the damning shipping manifests that proved her supply chain was a toxic lie. I sent the packet anonymously to the lead investigative journalist at an independent highly respected environmental watchdog publication. The exposé dropped online 48 hours later. The headline was a masterpiece of journalistic brutality. The Green Illusion. How high-fashion darling Verdant Threads is poisoning the planet for profit. I sat in my kitchen, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching the fallout on my tablet. The internet is a ruthless, unforgiving coliseum, and Harper had just been thrown to the lions. The social collapse was instantaneous and spectacular. I watched her company's Instagram page hemorrhage tens of thousands of followers by the hour. The influencers who had happily accepted her toxic, overpriced dresses the week before suddenly initiated a synchronized, panicked mass exodus. My feed was flooded with prominent fashion bloggers posting solemn sadier black and white apology videos, claiming they were horrified and deceived by verdant threads, publicly cutting all ties to save their own brand deals. Then came the operational chokehold. Through my shadow authority at Vanguard Horizon, I triggered an automated high-risk compliance flag on her corporate banking accounts. It was a standard, algorithmic precaution when a portfolio company faces severe negative press regarding potential fraud. Her accounts were instantly frozen. Simultaneously, I executed the customs seizure protocol, the very notification I received on my porch, acting on an anonymous, highly detailed tip regarding the importation of mislabeled, hazardous synthetic materials. Federal customs agents descended upon the port of Los Angeles. They impounded 15 of her shipping containers. Her entire Q3 inventory was effectively seized by the United States government. By Tuesday afternoon, Harper's world was a burning wreck. She couldn't pay her PR crisis team because her bank accounts were locked. She couldn't sell clothes because her inventory was sitting in federal lockup. Her warehouse landlord in New Jersey, sensing the impending bankruptcy, padlocked the doors and demanded cash for the next 6 months' rent. She was bleeding out, and she had nowhere to turn. Except, of course, to the people she considered entirely beneath her. The doorbell of my brownstone rang frantically at 8:00 p.m. It wasn't a polite chime, it was a desperate, sustained buzz, accompanied by the sound of heavy pounding on the weathered wood. I took my time walking to the front door, smoothing down my simple, knitted cardigan. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Harper stood on my porch, and the transformation was almost unrecognizable. The meticulously curated eco-warrior aesthetic had completely disintegrated. Her hair was greasy and pulled into a frantic, uneven knot. Her face was pale, devoid of the expensive contouring, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. She was still clutching that atrocious polyurethane tote bag, but her knuckles were white, her hands trembling violently. Julian stood a few feet behind her, looking utterly exhausted, the shadows under his eyes speaking volumes of the psychological hell he had endured over the last 48 hours. "Harper Julian," I said, widening my eyes in perfectly practiced, grandmotherly concern. "Goodness. It's late. Is everything all right?" "No, Beatrice. Everything is not all right." Harper shrieked, pushing past me into the hallway without waiting for an invitation. The aggressive perfume was gone, replaced by the sour, undeniable scent of pure panic. She paced my narrow hallway like a trapped animal, waving her phone in the air. "I am being targeted. It's a coordinated smear campaign by my competitors. They hacked my supply chain data. They manipulated the press. And now my bank is glitching and freezing my accounts, right when I need to pay my crisis management team." I closed the door gently. "That sounds terrible, dear. I don't really understand. Hacking. Have you called the police?" "The police can't fix a localized liquidity crisis." "Beatrice," she snapped, turning to glare at me with a vicious, desperate energy. "I need cash. Immediate, untraceable capital to unfreeze my supply chain and buy out the media narrative. Julian told me you own this house outright. There's no mortgage on it." I looked at Julian. He stared at the floorboards, unable to meet my eyes. He had clearly fought her on this, but her manipulation had broken him down. "Yes," I said slowly, playing the part of the bewildered, financially illiterate old woman perfectly. "My husband and I paid it off years ago. It's all I have left of him." "Great," Harper practically gasped, her eyes locking onto me with the predatory gleam of a starving wolf. "Then you need to take out a reverse mortgage. Right now, first thing tomorrow morning. This neighborhood is gentrifying. The equity must be worth at least $800,000. I need $500,000. Immediately. I'll pay you back with interest as soon as my secondary funding clears. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She had sat in this very house, eating my food, and called my home a ghetto. She had told me it was a biohazard and a toxic environment that she would never let her children visit. And now, she was standing in my hallway, aggressively demanding that I leverage the very home she despised to save her fraudulent, toxic company. I didn't get angry. I didn't throw her insults back in her face. That would break my cover. Instead, I gave her the most devastating weapon in a mother's arsenal. Polite. Helpless disappointment. I clasped my hands together, looking at her with an expression of deep, tragic sympathy. Oh, Harper. Honey. I wish I could help you. I truly do. You can. You just sign the papers. She yelled, stepping closer. I tried to look into that once. I lied. My voice wavering perfectly, sounding small and fragile. A few years ago, when the roof needed fixing, but the bank, they told me that because of my fixed, tiny pension, I didn't qualify. And you said yourself, Harper, just on Sunday, this is a ghetto. The banks don't want to give big loans for houses in historically untouched, dangerous neighborhoods like this. They said it's a bad investment. I'm so sorry. Harper froze. My words, her own words, perfectly repackaged and fed back to her, hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She couldn't argue. She couldn't call the house valuable without admitting she was a liar. And she couldn't call it worthless without accepting that she wasn't getting the money. I had boxed her into a corner constructed entirely of her own arrogance. Julian, she whimpered, turning to my son, her voice cracking. Tell her. Make her do it. Julian finally looked up. The illusion was gone. He looked at the woman he thought he loved, and he finally saw the parasite underneath. She said no, Harper, Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying a new, heavy finality. She can't do it. And even if she could, I wouldn't let her lose her home for your company. Harper let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She looked around the hallway, realizing that the poverty she had mocked was the one vault she could not crack. She spun around, grabbed the doorknob, and ripped the front door open. Fine, she spat, tears of pure rage spilling over her cheeks. I don't need your pathetic ghetto equity. I have a meeting with the board of Vanguard Horizon tomorrow. They are real investors. They understand high-level economics. They'll fix this. She slammed the door so hard, the framed photos on the wall rattled. I stood in the hallway, looking at Julian. He looked broken, but he was finally free. I'm sorry. Mom, he whispered. It's okay, Julian, I said, walking over and wrapping my arms around him. Sometimes, people have to learn the hard way. I hugged my son, resting my chin on his shoulder, staring into the dark corner of the hallway. Harper was going to Vanguard Horizon tomorrow, to beg the old men for salvation. She had absolutely no idea that the executioner she was running to was the very woman whose house she had just stormed out of. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be wearing a cardigan. Tomorrow, I was bringing the guillotine. Barcis. The boardroom panic. Wednesday morning broke over New York City with a cold, relentless, gray drizzle, the kind of weather that strips the romance from the city and leaves only its sharp, unforgiving architecture. I did not wear my knitted cardigan that morning. I did not put on my comfortable walking shoes. The grandmotherly facade of Beatrice Sterling was carefully folded away, replaced by the apex predator the financial district secretly feared. I dressed in my armor, a bespoke, charcoal gray suit tailored from Loro Piana Vicuña wool. There were no flashy logos, no ostentatious patterns, just the terrifying, immaculate precision of quiet luxury that commands a room before a single word is spoken. I fasna vintage. Platinum Patek Philippe Calatrava Mirist. It's soft, mechanical ticking, the only sound in the quiet of my bedroom. I left my brownstone and stepped into the back of a sleek, unmarked black town car that had been idling discreetly at the end of the block. Bajivien zero am. I was silently gliding up the private, biometric secured elevator to the 75th floor of the Vanguard Horizon skyscraper in Lower Manhattan. Stepping onto the executive floor is like stepping into a vacuum of absolute power. The air is heavily filtered, smelling faintly of cedar and expensive floor wax. The carpets are so thick they swallow the sound of footsteps completely. The walls are lined with modern art that appreciates faster than most national currencies. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. Far away from the ghetto Harper so deeply despised. My executive assistant, Elias, a ruthlessly efficient man who spoke 3 languages and could dismantle a corporate ledger faster than a supercomputer, was waiting for me as the elevator doors parted. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," Elias murmured, handing me a freshly bound dossier. "Our guest has arrived. She is currently holding in boardroom Alpha." Security confiscated her phone at the lobby level, per standard high-risk review protocol. "Thank you, Elias," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "What is her current state?" "She is unraveling, Mom," he noted with a tight, professional smile. I took the liberty of lowering the ambient temperature in boardroom Alpha to 64 degrees. It tends to discourage prolonged posturing. I gave him a slight, approving nod and walked past the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, overlooking the sprawling, rain-soaked concrete grid of the city. I bypassed the main corridor and entered the security observation room, a darkened space directly adjacent to boardroom Alpha, separated only by a wall of one-way, acoustically engineered mirror glass. I stood in the darkness, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, and watched Harper. She was completely alone in the massive, intimidating room. Boardroom Alpha was designed to make people feel microscopic. The ceiling was aggressively high, and the centerpiece was a 30-foot table carved from a single, continuous slab of black walnut. At the far end of this monolithic table sat Harper. She looked entirely out of her depth. The sustainable eco-founder aesthetic was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked attempt at traditional corporate attire. She wore a black blazer that was clearly purchased in a frantic rush. The shoulders were too sharp. The fabric had that stiff, synthetic sheen, and a microscopic white tag was still partially visible near the collar. She had her heavy, polyurethane tote bag clutched to her chest like a life preserver in a hurricane. I watched her physical tells. The room was freezing, and a visible shiver racked her thin frame. Her normally perfect posture was collapsing. She was rapidly bouncing her left knee under the table, the staccato rhythm echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. She reached up to chew nervously on her thumbnail, destroying the expensive, minimalist manicure she had undoubtedly bought with my money. Without her phone to distract her, without her social media echo chamber to validate her ego, she was forced to sit in the deafening silence of her own impending ruin. She began to mutter to herself. I tapped a button on the console, piping the boardroom's audio feed into my earpiece. "Gentlemen," Harper whispered to the empty leather chairs, her voice trembling. She cleared her throat and tried to lower her pitch, aiming for a tone of authority she fundamentally lacked. "Gentlemen of the board, the recent media narrative is nothing more than a coordinated corporate sabotage by legacy fashion brands threatened by my woe, by my disruptive vision. The supply chain anomalies are temporary oversights by third-party contractors. I assure you, my personal brand equity is strong enough to weather this." I let out a soft, freezing sigh in the dark observation room. She was still lying. Even now, standing on the precipice of total financial annihilation, facing a multi-million-dollar clawback, her instinct was to spin a narrative. She truly believed that Vanguard Horizon was run by a group of gullible, elderly men, whom she could manipulate with some strategic tears and tech bro vocabulary. She thought she could charm her way out of federal fraud. At 9:45 a.m., the heavy oak door of the boardroom clicked open. Harper violently flinched, practically jumping out of her seat. It was only Elias. He walked in carrying a silver tray with a single, crystal glass of ice water, placing it precisely in front of her. He did not make eye contact. "Excuse me," Harper stammered, her voice cracking as she desperately tried to project dominance over the assistant. When is the board arriving? I have a highly compressed schedule today, and I need to speak to my angel investor immediately to authorize the release of my frozen funds. Elias paused, his posture perfectly rigid. He looked down at her with the blank, terrifying politeness of a mortician. The board does not convene for compliance reviews. Ms. Harper, the managing partner will see you shortly. I advise you to review your contract while you wait. He turned and exited, the heavy door sealing shut with a definitive, airtight thud. Harper grabbed the glass of water with both hands. They were shaking so violently that the ice cubes clinked loudly against the crystal. She took a frantic gulp, accidentally spilling a few drops of freezing water down the lapel of her cheap blazer. She let out a frustrated, pathetic whimper, frantically trying to wipe the stain away, but only managed to rub it deeper into the synthetic fabric. She was broken. The arrogant, vicious woman who had sat at my dining room table and called my life a ghetto had been entirely stripped away. What remained was a terrified fraud, drowning in a sea of debt, waiting for a savior that did not exist. I stepped away from the one-way glass. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit, feeling the cool, solid weight of my watch against my skin. The wait was over. The psychological preparation was complete. She was perfectly primed, stripped of her armor, and drowning in the terrifying reality of the Vanguard Horizon boardroom. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway until I reached the heavy oak doors of Boardroom Alpha. I rested my hand on the cold, brushed steel handle. I didn't feel a rush of anger. I didn't feel the messy, chaotic thrill of vengeance. I felt only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a ledger about to be permanently balanced. I pushed the doors open and walked into the light. Par sept, the checkmate. The heavy oak doors of Boardroom Alpha swung open with a whisper of displaced air, and I stepped into the freezing expanse of the room. Harper's head snapped up so violently I thought I might hear her vertebrae crack. She had instinctively arranged her face into a mask of frantic, deferential pleading, ready to weaponize her tears and bat her eyelashes at whatever aging, gullible patriarch she assumed was about to walk through those doors. Instead, her eyes landed on me. I did not stop. I walked with the slow, measured cadence of a woman who owns the very ground she walks on. The soft, authoritative click of my heels against the polished hardwood was the only sound in the room. I reached the head of the 30-foot black walnut table and stood opposite her, resting my hands lightly on the cool wood. For a terrifyingly long 5 seconds, her brain simply refused to process the visual data. She stared at my bespoke Loro Piana suit, at the platinum Patek Philippe on my wrist, and finally, up to my face. She was searching for the helpless, fragile woman in the linen apron she had verbally abused on Sunday. But that woman was a ghost. The woman standing before her was the apex predator of the New York financial district. Beatrice, she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy squeak of profound confusion. She looked over my shoulder, desperately searching the empty hallway behind me. What are you doing here? Did Julian bring you? You can't be in here. Beatrice. This is a restricted executive floor. The managing partner is coming. I know, I interrupted, my voice barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the vast room like a scalpel. I pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table and sat down. I am already here. I watched the exact microscopic second her reality shattered. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to witness. The color drained from her face so rapidly her skin took on the waxy, translucent hue of a corpse. Her jaw went slack. The cheap, synthetic fabric of her hastily bought blazer trembled as a violent shudder racked her entire body. No, she breathed out, shaking her head in slow, frantic denial. No. Vanguard Horizon is an institution. You live in a brownstone. You made gumbo. You're a teacher. I was a teacher. 30 years ago, I replied softly, sliding the thick, bound dossier of her financial autopsy across the long expanse of the table. It came to a stop exactly 3 inches from her shaking hands. Before I built Vanguard Horizon, I am the sole, anonymous founder of this firm. I am the managing partner. And unfortunately for you, Harper, I am your angel investor. She stared at the dossier as if it were alive, explosive. She couldn't touch it. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was heaving, in short, jagged gasps. Her lungs fighting for air in a room that suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I reviewed the compliance documents you signed yesterday. I continued. My tone, clinical, devoid of a single ounce of empathy. The bridge loan authorization. You signed it without reading the extreme ESG compliance clause. A fatal error for a visionary founder. I can explain the supply chain, she stammered, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. The synthetic materials, it was a third-party vendor mistake. I didn't know the factories were toxic. I'm a victim of bad logistics. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. Do not insult my intelligence. Harper, I tracked the disbursements. I read your emails. You didn't just know about the toxic polymers. You actively instructed your manufacturers to bypass environmental safety protocols to increase your margin by 40 cents a yard. You poisoned water supplies to buy a luxury SUV. You expensed a Hamptons rental as R&D. You are not a victim. You are a parasite. She covered her face with her trembling hands, letting out a wretched, guttural sob. The walls of her delusion had completely collapsed, leaving her exposed to the brutal, freezing elements of reality. You sat at my dining room table, I whispered, lowering my voice, so she had to strain to hear her own execution. You pushed my food away and called it slop. You looked at the life I carefully built and called it a ghetto. You told me you would never let my future grandchildren step foot in my home. And yet, the very clothes on your back, the car you drove, the fake, high-net-worth aesthetic you so desperately tried to weaponize against me, was entirely funded by my ghetto capital. Please. She wept, sliding out of her chair and actually dropping to her knees on the thick carpet. Please. Beatrice. I'll do anything. I'll step down as CEO. Just don't trigger the clawback clause. It pierces the corporate veil. I'll be personally bankrupt. I'll owe millions. I'll go to jail for wire fraud. Please. For Julian's sake. He loves me. Right on cue. The secondary door connected to the observation room clicked open. Julian stepped into the boardroom. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out. He had stood behind the one-way glass and watched her practice her lies to the empty room. He had heard her try to blame a non-existent sabotage. He had seen the absolute core of her rot. Harper looked up, her mascara running in thick, black streaks down her face. Julianne, help me. Your mother. She's destroying me. Please. Tell her. Julian walked slowly over to the table. He looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor, the woman who had manipulated his kindness, mocked his heritage, and tried to bleed his family dry. She isn't destroying you. Harper, Julian said quietly, his voice echoing in the large room. You destroyed yourself. You were just too arrogant to read the fine print. Julianne. No! She screamed, reaching out to grab the hem of his trousers. He took a deliberate step back. Out of her reach. He looked at me, gave a slow, respectful nod, and without another word, turned and walked out of the boardroom. He didn't look back. The heavy door sealed shut behind him, severing the very last lifeline she possessed. Harper collapsed onto the floor, curling into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably into the expensive corporate carpet. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my suit. Your company, Verdant Threads, is now the legal property of Vanguard Horizon. We will be liquidating the remaining assets to pay off the vendors you defrauded. As for your personal liability, the federal authorities and the SEC have already been provided with the unredacted files. I believe they are currently waiting for you in the lobby. I looked down at her one last time. There was no triumph in my heart, only the quiet, necessary satisfaction of taking out the trash. Enjoy your high net worth lifestyle. Harper, I whispered. I turned and walked out of Boardroom Alpha, leaving her completely alone in the freezing, silent dark. And that, my friends, is how you execute a flawless, completely legal corporate checkmate. Sometimes, the universe doesn't deliver karma fast enough. So you have to roll up your sleeves and deliver it yourself. Thank you so much for listening to this story. What did you think of the trap I set? Was the bridge loan authorization too brutal? Or did she get exactly what she deserved for her extreme arrogance? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I love reading your reactions. If this story satisfied your craving for justice, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. We have plenty more stories of narcissists, gold diggers, and entitled family members getting the exact reality check they deserve. Until next time, stay humble, treat people with respect, and always read the fine print. I'll see you in the next one.